Chapter 1. When is your stuff arriving? Stopping in the master bedroom doorway, the tall man turned and leaned one heavy shoulder against the wooden frame, his golden eyes settling heavily on her. The man's stare unnerved her, it always had. For what had to be the 100th time since Sanaa stepped foot in her late grandmother's house and found the man waiting for her in the living room. She cursed herself for not reading her emails more carefully. Ever since her grandmother died over a year ago now, she had been corresponding with Tarky's only realtor and property management service via email to take care of the place until she decided what to do with it. After her parents had driven down from Seattle to pack away and take back the things they wanted to keep, it was left to her to decide the fate of everything else. From packing away what was left, covering and storing the remaining heavy pieces of antique furniture nobody wanted, and maintaining the property, the man in front of her had answered every single one of her overly detailed emails and fulfilled all of her exacting requests with short, succinct replies that somehow came off gruff even through email. Sanaa had expected Silhouettes to be an old bearded fisherman or maybe a worse for wear local handyman. What she did not and would not have ever imagined was Zaccariah Wattez standing in her grandmother's house holding the keys. Why didn't she ever consider that Zaccariah had a middle name? For nearly a year of back and forth emails, the unassuming signature of Zaccariah Wattez at the bottom was actually Zaccariah Wattez, just up to his old ways taunting her. Finding her voice, Sanaa took a practiced breath, stamping down the rush of anxiety she always got when near him. Tomorrow hopefully, she added, thinking of the inconveniently large window of time the moving company gave her. Nodding, he stared at her a few moments longer, the growing silence between them making her pulse race. Did he even remember her? Was he realizing the Sanaa he had been taking orders and payment from for nearly a year now was the same one he toyed and tormented all those years ago? She couldn't tell. His naturally stern face was unreadable as ever. Nodding, he turned around, continuing their conversation. Then that will give me time to come by early tomorrow before you get here and reinstall the bathroom cabinet doors. His deep voice vibrated gently off the empty walls of the hallway as he walked down the stairs. His heavy black boots made surprisingly little sound down the dark-stained wooden stairs. Sanaa's stomach leaped at the prospect of having to see him again so soon. She was barely hanging on as it was being this close to the man that punctuated so many of her teenage memories. Oh, okay. She breathed deeply as her hand slid down the shiny wooden banister in her slow pursuit after him. Well, I will be here, so any time I suppose is good for me. His tall figure stopped at the bottom of the stairs, causing her to pause a few steps up from the bottom. Turning around slowly, he gave her a questioning frown. At eye level with him now, she could see the pale scar she had noticed earlier much more clearly now. Starting a few inches above his eyebrow, the jagged cut slashed through the thick black hair of his eyebrow and down to his cheek underneath his eye. It gave his naturally stern yet handsome face a severe vicious quality. Even now fully healed, she could easily tell the scar had been deep. She couldn't help but wonder how he got it. He certainly didn't have it 7 years ago. Excuse me. The depth of Zaccariah's tone, along with his piercing golden stare, made her body seize up. Sanaa, he began deliberately, using her name as a warning and threat all at once. In your last email you stated you would be staying at the inn. Inn was a very generous title for Druthers Rest, an old 8-bedroom, converted Victorian run by a crotchety old woman, Mrs. Nowak, whose off-putting personality wouldn't allow anyone who met her to dare call the place something as warm and cozy sounding as a bed and breakfast. Fortunately for Mrs. Nowak, Tarky was located off a lonely 2-lane highway in Oregon that dead-ended 100 miles down in a city called Antier Falls and was sandwiched by a depressing little town called Galding even farther down the opposite direction of the highway, meaning the few visitors and even fewer tourists Tarky received were forced to stay at her inn. Standing up straighter, Sanaa reminded herself she was not the same person he manipulated 7 years ago. She was an adult now, damn it. Yes, but I decided not to. She tried to inflict a reasonable amount of haughty command in her voice. Zach's golden eyes narrowed with even more conviction, and Sanaa could see that her attempt at confidence failed miserably on him. Where are you going to sleep? By your instructions, he reminded her firmly. I have removed and taken all the mattresses to the dump. Oh, don't worry, she gave him a small smile, looking away from his strangely compelling eyes. Stepping to the side, she squeezed by him down the stairs and passed him to the front door. They make mattresses that compress and roll up into boxes now. I have one in my back seat. Standing near the front door, she looked back to see him facing her now. Sunlight from the stained glass arched window above the door shined down around him as he walked towards her. How could this have happened? After months of careful consideration, juggling her fears, doubts, and of course her mother's staunch disapproval, she left her job at a very prestigious company to move to a sleepy, rundown town off the Pacific Northwest coast. She had carefully planned for everything. A new job, a new home, and even possibly a new passion project she had always dreamed of, but here standing in front of her was the one person she thought she would never see again. Here was the man who had tormented her in his boyhood, who had turned her idyllic summers upside down with his crackling golden gaze, his sharp smile and dark good looks. He was supposed to be gone. He wasn't supposed to be standing here in front of her, bathed in colorful streams of light, making her blood pound through her veins. Dark bronze skin, a wide firm jaw with unsmiling lips that always hinted at a cruel knowing smirk. He stood tall and commanding in his thick black canvas jacket and dark jeans. His long midnight black hair settled down over his collar and past his shoulders, gleaming a healthy shine in the light, and, despite his arresting good looks, she could vividly remember his growling sneers and wicked unkept promises from years ago. So why was it that when he looked at her now, recognition did not light his eyes? How could he work in her grandmother's house for a year and email the girl whose life he went out of his way to make miserable and never say anything? Looking down at the perfectly polished floorboards at her feet, Sanaa nearly laughed. Maybe she was even more unremarkable than she thought. Sanaa had never been someone would describe as charming, outgoing, and definitely not vibrant. No, she was always the girl who kept her head down around strangers, someone who could most likely be caught reading at home on perfectly sunny days. It wasn't surprising at all he didn't remember her. He made a noise in his throat as he considered her words. Then turn on the heat now if you plan to be warm tonight. I haven't started it in weeks. And you might want to sleep in the smallest guest room since all of the others still have drying paint. Okay. Surprised by his consideration, she tried to wipe the shock from her eyes as he stepped past her for the front door. Well, thank you. She followed him out onto the deep front porch as he headed down the stairs. If I need anything, I guess I could. Turning at the base of the stairs, Zac looked up at her, his golden eyes somehow brighter even in the sunlight. Don't worry, Sanaa, he said, cutting her off. A small familiar smirk tugged at the side of his mouth, sending a flashing memory through her mind of a boy with golden eyes and sharp teeth who pulled her behind trees and kissed her without permission and bit her lip just to hear her cry out, "I'll be seeing you around." Welcome. Chapter 2. Waiting behind the front door, Sanaa listened to the fading sounds of gravel crunching underneath tires before finally emerging, breathing a sigh of relief. At the absence of his large blue pickup truck, she made her way to her SUV. Grabbing the large box that contained her mattress and her duffel bag from the front passenger seat, she began the slow process of unpacking her car. With the wind whipping through her hair, she paused, closing her eyes to feel the cool early October air against her warm cheeks, the suspended feeling in her stomach that she had for the last 3 months since she decided to take this life-altering leap finally dissipated as she looked at the lavender-painted house in front of her. With its 4 heavy wooden pillars and deep porch, the 2-story craftsman bungalow stood perfectly preserved in time. She had spent nearly every summer in this house as a kid. She had sat on the wide wooden stairs leading up to the vestibule door reading her books and playing cards with her younger brother, while her mom sat on the porch swing and talked with her aunt over the phone. This was it. She was finally back. She took the leap that her friends warned her not to take, and her parents certainly railed against. She was here, standing in front of her grandmother's house she spent a good deal of her childhood in as the new owner. From now on, this was her life, her future. Shutting the front door with her foot, she wheeled in her suitcase and balanced the paper bag of groceries in one arm. The bungalow seemed so much bigger now that it was empty of life and most of its contents When she was younger, this house always seemed so cramped with her and her younger brother, both of her parents and grandparents stuffed in the 4 bedrooms. But now, looking at it with the eyes of an adult who had paid rent for many a shoebox-sized apartment, she could appreciate the space so much more. The dining room off to the right of the front door still had the lengthy 8-person cherrywood table covered by a white sheet. Memories of the last family dinner shared at that table the summer she turned 17 felt vivid and real, like it was only yesterday. The tops of the dining room chairs, rising up underneath the covering, gave the table a ghostly appearance, much like all the other draped furniture in the house. Only the pieces of furniture that were too large and too elegant to bother moving remained in the house, along with all the custom built-ins. The living room currently had no couch, being given to her Aunt Priya in California, leaving only the giant Bornholm grandfather clock and ship captain's writing desk standing covered in dusty cloth against the wall, giving the room a wide-open feeling. Setting down the groceries on the kitchen counter, Sana began unpacking the little bit of groceries she brought along with her, placing the items in the refrigerator and pantry. Opening a cabinet, she paused at the sight of 4 neatly stacked mismatched plates next to a stack of 3 bowls and a small army of glasses in all shapes and sizes. Zac didn't mention the remaining dishes in any of his emails. Examining the organized rows of china and glasses, she had a hard time picturing Zaccariah Watiz, the renegade of Tarki, taking the time to carefully stack a bunch of stray dishes. But the evidence was right in front of her, all around her, in fact. Closing the cabinet door, she looked around at the freshly painted walls and remembered all the awful dated wallpaper that decorated every room in the house. Not anymore. After several dozen emails on her part, paint researching, and a small fortune being paid to Watiz Property Management Services, all of the walls in the house were stripped clean and painted the same soft coconut cream. The color incidentally turned out to be Zac's decision. After waiting nearly a week for her to decide on the paint color, she received an overnight letter at her apartment with a sticky note attached to a paint card sample that simply said, "Pick this one." And she did. Just by painting the walls, the transformation to the place was breathtaking, and the chosen color was perfect against the dark wood trim. Nighttime, she noticed with a glance out the window, was quickly approaching. Grabbing the mattress in a box, she dragged it up the stairs. The task was much harder than she anticipated. Why in God's name was compacted memory foam this damn heavy? Heaving it up the last stair, Sana paused with a tired exhale on the landing. Looking around the empty second floor, she peered out through one of the open bedroom doors to the windows within. The bungalow had many windows that gave it a lovely, airy, sun-drenched feeling during the day, while at night, well, it was a different feeling entirely. From the large matching picture windows in the living and dining room, the large bay windows in the kitchen, and the tall window on the stairwell landing, she felt like she was on display for anyone to see as night descended and her own reflection shined back at her on the glass. Memo: get curtains, she thought. Thankfully, her house was far down the end of the lane, surrounded by the forest on nearly all sides. She didn't have to worry about anyone passing by and watching her. Cutting open the box and decompressing her mattress, Sana began pulling off the remaining sheets covering the bedroom furniture. It felt weird sleeping in her grandparents' room, though it looked completely different now without their things and freshly painted. She still somehow felt like a child intruding in adult territory. Turning off all the lights in the house, she grabbed a green apple out of the fridge before heading back to her new room. Tomorrow her things would arrive, and the day after that, she would meet the mayors and city planners for all 3 Oregon towns, Galding, Tarki, and Antier Falls, and discuss her new job as their city's head engineer. Along the coast connecting all 3 cities would be a line of wind turbines along with an array of solar farms for each city. From now on, it would be her job to install and maintain the 3 cities' new power structure and sell any excess power generated back to the state. The job was going to be frightfully easy for someone with her skills. Smiling, she thought of her coworkers and supervisors telling her the same thing when she announced her decision. Why would a woman so young and as talented as you want to waste the rest of your life in a dead-end beach town? The truth was, she really didn't have a clear answer. Ever since her grandmother died, there was some sort of pull within her when she thought of this place, the sleepy little beach town where she spent all of her summers. The funny thing was, there wasn't even anything special about it. Visiting Tarky didn't make her acute social anxiety any less cringeworthy when she interacted with people. There were no particular coming-of-age moments that highlighted a particular portion of her childhood. If anything, there were plenty of frightening moments in Tarky, moments brought upon by the very man who stood in this very room with her earlier, looking at her as if he didn't remember her at all. Grabbing her brush from her bag, Sana snatched it a little too violently through her long black hair as she sat on the edge of her bed. How could a man who spent most of his free time harassing her for 2 summers just forget her so easily when all she ever did was recall his cruel, handsome face in her waking dreams? Not that she wanted him to remember her, she thought with rising heat to her cheeks. It was actually better if he forgot all about her. But her pride couldn't seem to agree with her logic. It hurt a far lot more than she would have ever imagined, knowing that the handsome town rebel who tormented her each summer, making them unforgettable and painful all at once, grew up to simply forget her. Standing up, she tossed her brush onto the built-in vanity near the 4-poster bed. The vanity's mirror was a beautiful lantern-shaped design that narrowed at the top before swelling out in the middle and narrowing again at the base. Looking at her reflection, she couldn't help but wonder what Zac saw when he looked at her now. To her, she looked no different than the skinny high school girl with large brown eyes he met all those years ago. Her hair was longer now, but still the same shade of dark brown that looked black in most light. Thankfully, by everything that was holy and good in this world, her figure finally filled out a bit. Food finally stuck to her bones, as her grandmother had put it, instead of melting away with her too high metabolism. She was thicker and a little curvier now, but not enough to make her a bombshell like other women she envied. Angry at her turn of thoughts, she turned on her heel away from the mirror. Who gave a toss what Zaccaria? What he's thought of her anyway? This was her adventure, her fresh start, and she refused to think about him again. Since there was no lamp by her bed yet, she had to turn off the light switch on the wall before making her way back to the bed. Moonlight from the curtainless window helped guide her way back across the empty room. Pulling back the thin sheet she had brought with her in her duffel bag, she glanced out the picture window which faced the front of the house. Standing at the edge of the forest near the single-lane drive was a large dark figure. The shape was unmistakable even from this distance. Quietly sitting, staring up directly at her, was a large black wolf with eyes she could swear were golden. Chapter 3. 8 years ago. It was the summer she turned 16 when she first saw the wolf. Sitting on the porch with her back against the railings post, Sana was reading the instructions on her new camera as her grandfather sat on the porch's swing reading a book. After forcing her to play hide-and-seek for nearly an hour, her 7-year-old brother Kamal was inside, sleeping on the couch. Lifting her camera, she put her eye to the viewfinder and panned it around the porch. Her old camera was a film point-and-shoot model, and though she always managed to take photos that her family and teachers said were great, she knew that now with this very expensive digital SLR model she could really get some great shots. You know, Sana, her grandfather began as he looked up from his book and smiled at her. If you take the trail into the forest, it will lead you to an old quarry this town used to mine years ago, he informed her. Since it closed years ago, the quarry now is little more than a deep pond being filled in by rain and streams over the years. Sana's eyes widened as she tried to imagine the filled-in quarry he described. Her grandmother had told her and her mom a couple of years ago that when she and Grandpa moved in, he had spent a lot of his free time exploring the town and the huge forest, Druthers Forest, that bordered their town and the 2 other neighboring towns. Her grandmother said he would spend all day roaming around those woods before eventually coming home to report his findings. Old, long-forgotten cabins, a few native markings, and other small abandoned clues, all pointing to the past and hidden within the towering pine trees. How far is it? She asked, excited but apprehensive. Her father always lightly teased her of her cautious nature while her mother scolded him for doing so. Her mother, Fatima Bhatt, nurtured her daughter's cautious outlook on life, believing it was far better to be dubious than sorry. Her grandfather cocked his head in thought and looked to the small, almost indiscernible break in the forest tree line. It's not too far, maybe about a 15-minute walk to and back. Just stay on the trail and don't veer off. You will know if you have. Following his line of sight, she stared at the entrance of the small walking trail into the thick forest. Her first thought was no, as it always was. Lately, as she observed her friends' growing social life back in Seattle, Sanaa was starting to realize that perhaps she was a killjoy. When invited out to hang on a Saturday night, Sanaa felt compelled to know the full itinerary of the evening before agreeing to go. What transportation were they using? Who was going along? Exactly where were they going? With each question she could see the regret in her friend's eyes for even asking her to join. Sanaa couldn't even pinpoint when she became like this, when she allowed worry to supersede the prospect of a good time. She wanted to change that about herself. Standing up from the porch, she brushed off her burgundy cotton shorts and straightened her mustard-colored shirt. Okay, I will try and see if I can find it. The approving smile on her grandfather's face made her heart soar. She had a feeling he had wanted her to take this tiny journey almost for the same reason she did. Try to be back before 1, he called out as she descended the porch stairs. She smiled back at him, giving him a nod, knowing he really meant for her to get back before her mother came back from town. With her camera strap around her neck, Sanaa walked into the break in the tree line. The trail was just as easy to follow as her grandfather indicated. The earth beneath her sneakers was packed and a little moist from the morning's rain, scattered with dead leaves here and there. Wild ferns sprouted along the side of the worn path, making her wonder how many times a week did her grandfather take this path to keep it from being overgrown. Stopping occasionally, she focused her camera's sights on shafts of sunlight spearing through the branches or a bird standing idly by. Looking down the path ahead, Sanaa picked up her pace at the sight of a tall rock structure ahead. Partly covered in moss, the large slab of rock was piled high on top of similar heavier ones with naturally organized geometry that drew the human. Holding her camera up, she adjusted the lens with her right hand, pulling the lens back to zoom out as she panned upwards. A large black shape at the top of the rocks caused her to go still, dropping her camera from her face. Sanaa looked again with both eyes this time, but the rock ledge was empty. Releasing a deep breath, she let herself smile at her paranoia. The forest was quiet. Only the chiming sounds of birds fluttering high above her broke the stillness in the air. Glancing back at the still empty rock ledge, she picked her way around the large structure, using the coarse wall of the rock as leverage as she stepped over smaller boulders. Coming around, her eyes finally settled on the glimmering objective of her journey. Sanaa let out a soft laugh of excitement as she hurriedly followed the natural sloping path around the pond. It was beautiful and so magnificently clear. When her grandfather mentioned the pond, she imagined a small murky green pond filled with mosquitoes and other unpleasant life forms. This was nothing like that at all. For starters, it was huge. At last she made it down the incline where the walls of the quarry pond were at their lowest. Looking around, she smiled when she spotted a stacking of bedrock that would allow anyone to climb in and out of the pond with ease. She couldn't help but wonder how many of the people of Tarkey knew about this place. Right now, most of the kids in town were still in school and they wouldn't be released for summer vacation until the end of the week. Did any of them come here? Did they use that giant rock ledge at the top of the incline as a jumping point to plunge into the deepest part of the clear water? Pulling her camera back to her eye, she knelt down and snapped a few shots of the water. She hoped the natural lines of the once working quarry would show up in her photos. Even now, through the clear water, she could still see the neat horizontal lines that the people of Tarkey dug into the wall years ago as they mined for minerals. Snapping a few more shots, she paused as she looked back up to the rock ledge at the top of the hill where she came from. Letting her gaze slowly follow the tree line around the secret watering hole, she let her mind drift to a more audacious thought. Glancing back at the clear water, she bent down and gave a hesitant touch to the water's surface. It was cool, but surprisingly not freezing as she initially suspected. Looking around once more, she abandoned the internal debate she was having. Setting her camera carefully down against the mossy rocks, she grabbed the hem of her shirt and quickly pulled it over her head. Unbuttoning her burgundy shorts, she slipped them off next. Wearing only her pink bra and yellow underwear, she used the natural stairs along the edge and stepped into the deep pond. Submerging into the water, the cool temperature nearly took her breath away. Laughing, she plunged forward and swam towards the middle of the pond, and dived in deeper. Underneath the water was a world of soft and dark greens, all falling into a natural formation. The stunning geological pattern of reds, grays and browns where the earth had been dug into along the rock walls looked so perfect it almost seemed intentional. Swimming back up to the surface, Sana took a deep breath. Pushing back her hair, she waded in the water, turning slowly. Gradually, her eyes settled back on the rock ledge above and the pair of golden eyes staring back at her. Sana nearly screamed. Laying calmly on the flat top of the rock ledge was a skinny black wolf, watching her. Every instinct wanted her to scramble out of the water and make a mad dash back to her grandparents' house, but logic kept her still. Wolves were far faster than humans, and running would only make it want to chase her. She needed to be calm. Without taking her eyes from it, Sana swam backward toward the rock ledge where her clothes and camera were. The wolf's golden eyes stared at her with what she swore was amused curiosity. Feeling the ledge hit her back, Sana gripped the sides with both hands, hoisting herself up, backward and up the natural steps in the rocks. The black wolf sat up a little straighter at her new position. Sana froze. His eyes were focused on her as she stood there, drenched only in her underwear. His fuzzy black tail began to slowly wag in big flaps against the rock. He seemed almost pleased, she thought with a frown. Bending down, she carefully grabbed her clothes and shoes, slipping them on before grabbing her camera. Her fear and her cool, wet skin made her start to shake as she tried to calmly figure out how to circle around the wolf and still get home. Looking to her left, she tried to quickly access the trees and the terrain back up the hill before turning her head back to keep an eye on the wolf. But when she looked back, there was no wolf. Fear seized her muscles, freezing her to the spot. Where was it? Looking around with held breath, she combed the trees with her eyes for what felt like minutes, but she could hear or see nothing. Taking a deep breath, she decided this was her only chance. With deep lunging steps, she made it back up the rocky incline in record time and even faster time back down the trail. She nearly collapsed in relief as she broke through the tree line surrounding her grandparents' house and out of the clutches of the forest. Running up the porch stairs, she nearly ran into Adam Watiz, who was standing next to her grandfather, still sitting peacefully in his porch swing. Her grandfather stopped mid-sentence and watched her with open curiosity as she sagged heavily against the porch railing, out of breath. I take it you found the pond? Her grandfather nodded at her, referring to her still wet hair and clothes. Yes, she said with a great breath. Standing up straighter, she braced both hands against the railing and gave Mr. Watiz a polite smile before looking back to her grandfather. And a wolf. Mr. Watiz, who had been staring at her disheveled appearance with a friendly smirk, frowned suddenly. You were at the old quarry? Yes, her grandfather answered for her. He had his own look of worry on his face at her news. I thought it would be a great spot for her to explore and take pictures. Mr. Watiz rubbed at the back of his neck as he nodded in agreement, but she could see by the crease on his forehead he was still displeased by what she said. Turning to her, he looked at her directly. Tell me, what color was this wolf? Standing well over 6 feet tall and built like a Samoan, Mr. Watiz was part of the large group of Katsi First Nation people that settled in Tarki and Antier Falls a generation back. Originally from British Columbia, the Katsi people were said to have just appeared one night in both towns, bringing nearly 100 people to each town. As expected, there were some locals against their sudden appearance, calling it an invasion. But despite the initial obstacles, the Watiz clan had integrated themselves perfectly into the societies until mostly no one could say a bad thing about them. Mr. Watiz had become Tarki's unanimous handyman, plumber and construction foreman. There was nothing he could not build or fix. Since her grandfather was older now, Mr. Watiz took it upon himself to come cut the large yard surrounding the property with only her grandmother's roasted lamb as a monthly payment. It was black with golden eyes, she answered, looking from her grandfather to Mr. Watiz, whose frown only grew deeper when he didn't say anything more. She pressed further. Have you seen that one before? As if jarred from his thoughts, Mr. Watiz shook his head and smiled. Yes. And don't worry, that one is harmless, but... He paused, giving her a serious look, which was rare for the man who always had an easygoing smile and personality to match. It's best not to tempt him. Chapter 3. 8 years ago. It was the summer she turned 16 when she first saw the wolf. Sitting on the porch with her back against the railings post, Sanaa was reading the instructions on her new camera as her grandfather sat on the porch's swing reading a book. After forcing her to play hide-and-seek for nearly an hour, her 7-year-old brother Kamal was inside sleeping on the couch. Lifting her camera, she put her eye to the viewfinder and panned it around the porch. Her old camera was a film point-and-shoot model, and though she always managed to take photos that her family and teachers said were great, she knew that now with this very expensive digital SLR model she could really get some great shots. You know, Sanaa, her grandfather began as he looked up from his book and smiled at her. If you take the trail into the forest, it will lead you to an old quarry this town used to mine years ago, he informed her. Since it closed years ago, the quarry now is little more than a deep pond being filled in by rain and streams over the years. Sanaa's eyes widened as she tried to imagine the filled-in quarry he described. Her grandmother had told her and her mom a couple of years ago that when she and Grandpa moved in, he had spent a lot of his free time exploring the town and the huge forest, Druthers Forest, that bordered their town and the 2 other neighboring towns. Her grandmother said he would spend all day roaming around those woods before eventually coming home to report his findings. Old, long-forgotten cabins, a few native markings, and other small abandoned clues, all pointing to the past and hidden within the towering pine trees. How far is it? She asked, excited but apprehensive. Her father always lightly teased her of her cautious nature while her mother scolded him for doing so. Her mother, Fatima Bhatt, nurtured her daughter's cautious outlook on life, believing it was far better to be dubious than sorry. Her grandfather cocked his head in thought and looked to the small, almost indiscernible break in the forest tree line. It's not too far, maybe about a 15-minute walk to and back. Just stay on the trail and don't veer off. You will know if you have. Following his line of sight, she stared at the entrance of the small walking trail into the thick forest. Her first thought was no, as it always was. Lately, as she observed her friends' growing social life back in Seattle, Sanaa was starting to realize that perhaps she was a killjoy. When invited out to hang on a Saturday night, Sanaa felt compelled to know the full itinerary of the evening before agreeing to go. What transportation were they using? Who was going along? Exactly where were they going? With each question she could see the regret in her friend's eyes for even asking her to join. Sanaa couldn't even pinpoint when she became like this, when she allowed worry to supersede the prospect of a good time. She wanted to change that about herself. Standing up from the porch, she brushed off her burgundy cotton shorts and straightened her mustard-colored shirt. Okay, I will try and see if I can find it. The approving smile on her grandfather's face made her heart soar. She had a feeling he had wanted her to take this tiny journey almost for the same reason she did. Try to be back before 1, he called out as she descended the porch stairs. She smiled back at him, giving him a nod, knowing he really meant for her to get back before her mother came back from town. With her camera strap around her neck, Sanaa walked into the break in the tree line. The trail was just as easy to follow as her grandfather indicated. The earth beneath her sneakers was packed and a little moist from the morning's rain, scattered with dead leaves here and there. Wild ferns sprouted along the side of the worn path, making her wonder how many times a week did her grandfather take this path to keep it from being overgrown. Stopping occasionally, she focused her camera's sights on shafts of sunlight spearing through the branches or a bird standing idly by. Looking down the path ahead, Sanaa picked up her pace at the sight of a tall rock structure ahead. Partly covered in moss, the large slab of rock was piled high on top of similar heavier ones with naturally organized geometry that drew the human. Holding her camera up, she adjusted the lens with her right hand, pulling the lens back to zoom out as she panned upwards. A large black shape at the top of the rocks caused her to go still. Dropping her camera from her face, Sanaa looked again with both eyes this time, but the rock ledge was empty. Releasing a deep breath, she let herself smile at her paranoia. The forest was quiet. Only the chiming sounds of birds fluttering high above her broke the stillness in the air. Glancing back at the still empty rock ledge, she picked her way around the large structure using the coarse wall of the rock as leverage as she stepped over smaller boulders. Coming around, her eyes finally settled on the glimmering objective of her journey. Sanaa let out a soft laugh of excitement as she hurriedly followed the natural sloping path around the pond. It was beautiful and so magnificently clear. When her grandfather mentioned the pond, she imagined a small murky green pond filled with mosquitoes and other unpleasant life forms. This was nothing like that at all. For starters, it was huge. At last she made it down the incline where the walls of the quarry pond were at their lowest. Looking around, she smiled when she spotted a stacking of bedrock that would allow anyone to climb in and out of the pond with ease. She couldn't help but wonder how many of the people of Tarkey knew about this place. Right now, most of the kids in town were still in school and they wouldn't be released for summer vacation until the end of the week. Did any of them come here? Did they use that giant rock ledge at the top of the incline as a jumping point to plunge into the deepest part of the clear water? Pulling her camera back to her eye, she knelt down and snapped a few shots of the water. She hoped the natural lines of the once working quarry would show up in her photos. Even now, through the clear water, she could still see the neat horizontal lines that the people of Tarkey dug into the wall years ago as they mined for minerals. Snapping a few more shots, she paused as she looked back up to the rock ledge at the top of the hill where she came from. Letting her gaze slowly follow the tree line around the secret watering hole, she let her mind drift to a more audacious thought. Glancing back at the clear water, she bent down and gave a hesitant touch to the water's surface. It was cool, but surprisingly not freezing as she initially suspected. Looking around once more, she abandoned the internal debate she was having. Setting her camera carefully down against the mossy rocks, she grabbed the hem of her shirt and quickly pulled it over her head. Unbuttoning her burgundy shorts, she slipped them off next. Wearing only her pink bra and yellow underwear, she used the natural stairs along the edge and stepped into the deep pond. Submerging into the water, the cool temperature nearly took her breath away. Laughing, she plunged forward and swam towards the middle of the pond, and dived in deeper. Underneath the water was a world of soft and dark greens, all falling into a natural formation. The stunning geological pattern of reds, grays and browns where the earth had been dug into along the rock walls looked so perfect it almost seemed intentional. Swimming back up to the surface, Sana took a deep breath. Pushing back her hair, she waded in the water, turning slowly. Gradually, her eyes settled back on the rock ledge above and the pair of golden eyes staring back at her. Sana nearly screamed. Laying calmly on the flat top of the rock ledge was a skinny black wolf, watching her. Every instinct wanted her to scramble out of the water and make a mad dash back to her grandparents' house, but logic kept her still. Wolves were far faster than humans, and running would only make it want to chase her. She needed to be calm. Without taking her eyes from it, Sana swam backward toward the rock ledge where her clothes and camera were. The wolf's golden eyes stared at her with what she swore was amused curiosity. Feeling the ledge hit her back, Sana gripped the sides with both hands, hoisting herself up backward and up the natural steps in the rocks. The black wolf sat up a little straighter at her new position. Sana froze. His eyes were focused on her as she stood there, drenched only in her underwear. His fuzzy black tail began to slowly wag in big flaps against the rock. He seemed almost pleased, she thought with a frown. Bending down, she carefully grabbed her clothes and shoes, slipping them on before grabbing her camera. Her fear and her cool, wet skin made her start to shake as she tried to calmly figure out how to circle around the wolf and still get home. Looking to her left, she tried to quickly access the trees and the terrain back up the hill before turning her head back to keep an eye on the wolf. But when she looked back, there was no wolf. Fear seized her muscles, freezing her to the spot. Where was it? Looking around with held breath, she combed the trees with her eyes for what felt like minutes, but she could hear or see nothing. Taking a deep breath, she decided this was her only chance. With deep lunging steps, she made it back up the rocky incline in record time and even faster time back down the trail. She nearly collapsed in relief as she broke through the tree line surrounding her grandparents' house and out of the clutches of the forest. Running up the porch stairs, she nearly ran into Adam Watiz, who was standing next to her grandfather, still sitting peacefully in his porch swing. Her grandfather stopped mid-sentence and watched her with open curiosity as she sagged heavily against the porch railing, out of breath. I take it you found the pond? Her grandfather nodded at her, referring to her still wet hair and clothes. Yes, she said with a great breath. Standing up straighter, she braced both hands against the railing, and gave Mr. Watis a polite smile before looking back to her grandfather. And a wolf. Mr. Watis, who had been staring at her disheveled appearance with a friendly smirk, frowned suddenly. You were at the old quarry? Yes, her grandfather answered for her. He had his own look of worry on his face at her news. I thought it would be a great spot for her to explore and take pictures. Mr. Watis rubbed at the back of his neck as he nodded in agreement, but she could see by the crease on his forehead he was still displeased by what she said. Turning to her, he looked at her directly. Tell me, what color was this wolf? Standing well over 6 feet tall and built like a Samoan, Mr. Watis was part of the large group of Katsi First Nation people that settled in Tarki and Antier Falls a generation back. Originally from British Columbia, the Katsi people were said to have just appeared one night in both towns, bringing nearly 100 people to each town. As expected, there were some locals against their sudden appearance, calling it an invasion. But despite the initial obstacles, the Watis clan had integrated themselves perfectly into the societies until mostly no one could say a bad thing about them. Mr. Watis had become Tarki's unanimous handyman, plumber and construction foreman. There was nothing he could not build or fix. Since her grandfather was older now, Mr. Watis took it upon himself to come cut the large yard surrounding the property with only her grandmother's roasted lamb as a monthly payment. It was black with golden eyes, she answered, looking from her grandfather to Mr. Watis, whose frown only grew deeper when he didn't say anything more. She pressed further. Have you seen that one before? As if jarred from his thoughts, Mr. Watis shook his head and smiled. Yes. And don't worry, that one is harmless, but… He paused, giving her a serious look, which was rare for the man who always had an easygoing smile and personality to match. It's best not to tempt him. Chapter 4. Adjusting the heavy brass samovar in her arms, Sana winced at the heavy thud of one of her boxes hitting the ground as the moving men unloaded the truck. Stepping forward to catch the eye of the man who she assumed was the leader of the other 3 men that had initially piled out of the truck upon arrival, she stopped him. Please, can they be more careful? She forced herself to ask, despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Unlike her mother and brother, she just wasn't built for possible confrontation. Her whole life she detested situations that forced her to assert herself or make her wants known. It was a trait her mother constantly criticized her for. I know you guys might be on a tight schedule. She attempted to mollify any possible edge to her tone. But I'm afraid you might break something in your rush to get done. Wearing a dingy, badly stained company t-shirt, the head mover gave her a tired look she couldn't be sure was for her benefit only or simply his permanent face. Ma'am, I can promise that we aren't damaging your things. The boxes are heavy and they simply sound like that when we set them down, he explained with a dragging, tired sigh that underlined each word. The speech was so dry and rehearsed, Sana was positive he had probably said it dozens of times before. But she opened her mouth to speak again as she adjusted the samovar to her other arm, but the growling sound of an engine captured both of their attentions. The sight of the motorcycle coming towards them up the narrow street filled her with a different wave of anxiousness. Black hair gleamed in the sunlight as the rider slowed to a stop a few feet away. Swinging one leg over the bike, Zac grabbed a heavy-looking tool bag strapped to the back of his bike with one hand as she and the grimy moving man watched. Pathetically, she couldn't help but notice the bulge of Zac's big bronze bicep curl and harden just below the line of his black t-shirt sleeve as he hefted the weight of the bag. He was so much bigger than he used to be. When did he get this big? Yesterday. She just assumed most of the bulk was his thick jacket. It wasn't, dear God, it wasn't. Straightening away from the bike, Zac turned and walked towards the house, giving her an indiscernible look before his gold gaze hardened on the mover standing next to her, giving him a scrutinizing glare. Cabinets, oh yes, she remembered he was here to finish putting on the cabinet doors in the master bathroom, and then he was gone. Trying to refocus herself, she turned back to the mover, but the man already took her moment of distraction to flee. Zac was halfway up the porch stairs when the resounding thud of one of her boxes went tumbling carelessly to the ground. Sana didn't get the chance to even consider what she would even say before they all heard the reverberating sound of Zac's angry voice bouncing off every surface. Hey! Zack's deep bark captured everyone's attention immediately. One mover just beyond the front door behind Zack and the remaining 3 out. On the lawn all froze. I'm only going to say this once. Taking one threatening step down the stairs, Zack pointed one damning finger at the mover in charge. If I hear any of you dropping one more fucking box, not only will you not get paid for this, but you will drive all the way back to Seattle with an assortment of broken bones between the 4 of you. Sana could hardly believe what she was hearing, much less have the capabilities of responding. Her mouth just gaped open as she stared from Zack's angry face to the befuddled head mover. You can't say. The mover stuttered in outrage, finally finding his voice. I can't what? Zack's eyebrows shot up in challenge, and Sana could swear she caught a glimmer of excitement pass through his eyes. Say that again. Couldn't quite hear you. Zack dropped his tool bag with a heavy thump and took another step down the porch steps. The head mover said nothing. None of them did. They all just stood frozen to Zack's overwhelming dominating energy as it crackled in the air around them. Getting no answer, Zack pointed to the box that fell to the ground earlier and spoke again, this time softer and somehow much more menacing. Take the boxes out of the truck, carefully set them down in the appropriate rooms, then get the hell out of here. The men said nothing as they quickly and obediently started moving, working with a level of diligence and care they definitely didn't possess before. Walking over to Zack with the heavy samovar still clutched in her arms, Sana waited until the movers were out of hearing range before she turned on him. Why did you do that? She hissed. Because you wouldn't, he answered dryly as he turned from her to watch one of the movers come and grab another box. From the look on the nervous man's face as he carefully hoisted the box, Sana knew the weight of Zack's stare was unbearable. You are right, I wouldn't, she argued. I could never threaten a man. What if they call the police? Zack shrugged. Unlike in the past, the sheriff in Tarkey is a Watiz now, including the sheriff in Antier Falls, and the one in Galding is a family friend. Sana didn't even know what to say to that. Reaching for the samovar in her arms, Zack's knuckles brushed against her breast as he took the heavy tea urn from her. Sana had to restrain herself from jumping back. Glancing away, she tried to think of something to say. Not waiting around, Zack walked up the stairs balancing the samovar in one arm and bending to grab his drop tool bag with the other before walking through the open front door. With no real choice, Sana followed him inside. Stopping in the dining room, Zack sat the heavy brass tea urn onto the built-in buffet, facing the table and picture window before turning to go upstairs. She stood there staring at the placed tea urn in silence for minutes as the sound of movers' footsteps echoed above and around her in the house. Zack remembered. He remembered everything, right down to where her grandparents' samovar used to sit. Walking up to the decorated urn, she let her hands glide over the curved tap, an ornate key that stuck out of it. Her family would all gather around the dining room table and drink tea, tell stories and share memories with smiles and laughter. It was always one of her favorite traditions with her grandparents. It was a lasting familial memory that she called upon in the best and worst of times. It was a memory she had hoped she could turn into her future with her own family one day. Running the pads of her fingers up the scrolling brass artwork, she pictured Zack's long fingers touching the urn, somehow invading her precious dreams for the future like he invaded every other aspect of her life. Without any doubt, she knew that man remembered her. The cabinet doors are back on. The deep timbre of Zack's voice from behind her nearly made her jump in shock. Whirling around, she looked to see him standing in the entryway of her dining room a few feet away with his tool bag in one hand. His smile was almost feral. You need me to hang around and threaten any more movers for you? Stiffening, Sana lifted her chin and cast him a withering stare. No thank you, Mr. Watiz. Have a good day. Sana could see the sudden flash of irritation in his gilded eyes at the clear dismissal in her voice. She was just about to let out a sigh of relief when he turned towards the door, but of course, he stopped and turned back to her with a sharp grin. Well, if you need anything, neighbor, he said with a mocking friendly tone. I'm just down the street at the first house on the right. You know, the red one. It used to belong to. He paused, scratching his chin for show as if he really had to recall who it was. She knew immediately what house he was referring to. How could she not? The Camersons had lived there for decades. His face brightened with fake recollection. The Camersons, he drawled. Do you remember them? Though his infernal tone inflected at a question, she could tell by the glint. In his eyes he was simply teasing her, waiting for a reaction. She refused to give him one. She would not allow herself to be toyed with by Zaccariah. What's ever again? She gave him a practiced nonchalant smile. Yes, of course. And if for some reason I need you, Mr. What's, I will consider calling. Sanaa's stomach did a small flip at the dangerous narrowing of his gilded eyes. Before he finally turned and left, strapping his tool bag onto his bike, Zac resisted the urge to let out the growl thrumming in his throat, the urge to march back up the stairs and kick everyone else out of the house and lay Sanaa down on top of that dining room table was nearly blinding. Swinging his leg over the bike, Zac pushed it upright, steadying it with his thighs before grabbing the bars and kicking back the stand with his foot. Igniting the engine, he let the powerful hum of the machine whir through his body, soothing the animalistic rage bubbling beneath the surface. After all this time she was back just like he knew she would be. Unfortunately, he was back at square fucking one with her though. Riding past his house, he turned onto the main road that led to the highway. He opened the engine up. Closing his eyes, he concentrated on the feeling of the wind in his hair before opening them again. Habitual now, Zac let memories of the first time he met her replay for the countless time in his mind. When he was 17, he and his mother, Sandra What's, had moved to Turkey from Los Angeles. After the death of his father, they had been forced to hop around from one shithole neighborhood to another for a year until finally, they received a knock on their door from a man Zac could only remember seeing once or twice when he was younger. It turned out his uncle, Adam What's, had been looking for them after he received word of his estranged brother's death. To Zac's horror, his mother hadn't put up a single argument when his uncle told them, not asked, to pack their bags and be ready by the morning. Zac railed and argued with her about moving to some godforsaken little town in the middle of nowhere, but for the first time, his soft-spoken mother told him quite firmly the full facts of their situation. There was no money. The little bit of savings she and his dad had accumulated was long gone, and they were dangerously close to living on the streets. Between that and other factors she didn't have to explain to him, the arrival of his uncle was a godsend. To say the transition had been hard would have been a goddamn understatement. Turkey, Oregon was Zac's living hell. There was nothing to do, no one of any intelligence to fucking talk to, maybe besides his scores of cousins, and most of them were either too young or too sheltered to stand to be around. They all looked at him as if he was akin to a hardened prisoner let loose in their innocent, bucolic village. And in a way he supposed they were correct. He wasn't like them, even in the places he had thought, hoped it counted. He was different, angrier, wilder. By the time Sanaa arrived into town that summer, Zac had nearly lost his mind to boredom. His uncle, who Zac had slowly and begrudgingly came to respect, had him working all summer with only a couple hours here and there for time to himself. That was when he happened to see her. He had been helping set up the summer festival when he sensed her across the field. Eucalyptus and lavender, her fresh scent floated on the air, permeating his very existence with the announcement of her arrival. She was the only other one around his age there to help that day. She and who he assumed was her little brother were taking instructions from his aunt on how she wanted the balloons filled and placed along the stage area. With a shy smile, Sanaa readily assisted everyone who called to her, all the while patiently herding her overexcited brother to follow and trying to keep a close eye on the kid. Zac could practically smell the quiet innocence from the skinny and wide-eyed girl from where he was standing across the field. She was nothing like the girls he fooled around with back in LA. Hell, she was a child compared to those girls. But fuck if she didn't activate every base and predatory instinct within him on sight. Zac was halfway down the ladder with every intention of heading her way when he felt the crushing force of Adam What's grip on his shoulder. Zac had froze. When he had moved in with his uncle, it didn't take long for Zac to learn one of the most crucial lessons in his new home. No matter who Zac thought he was back in LA, no matter how many changes Zac was going through in his transition to something beyond mere manhood, his uncle's word was law. Don't even think about it, boy. His uncle's normally pleasant voice changed to a tone he normally only reserved for Zac and anyone else dumb enough to step out of line. The gravelly voice shook right through his hand and into Zach's shoulder. I have known that child since she was in elementary and, trust me when I say, she is far too good for you. His uncle had left him standing there that day, thoroughly warned against going anywhere near Sanabat, a warning Zach knew there would be hell to pay if he disobeyed. Grinning at the memory, Zach pulled the throttle tighter until he surged forward even faster down the lonely highway. What was the cost of hell anyways, when his soul was already claimed by a girl who didn't even know it? All of the boxes were distributed to their proper room and awaiting to be unpacked. Sitting on her newly delivered couch, Sana took a deep tired breath and flopped backward onto the plush cushion. Looking at the ceiling, she rested one arm over her forehead lazily as her mind drifted to that infernal man. Why did she not call anyone she still knew down here to check? To see if Zaccariah was still here. Not only was the man still here, he was her blasted neighbor, for crying out loud. He had done this on purpose. She was sure of it. He had certainly remembered her name the moment she emailed about the property management services and said about ruining her life. He probably ousted whoever had bought the Camersons' house with threats and classic Zaccariah Watti's intimidation just so he could be near her to torture her as he did years ago. Losing herself in the endless white expanse of her ceiling, Sana easily recalled the day she first met Zaccariah. It was the next day after her frightening experience at the quarry pond. All night she had dreamed of a golden-eyed wolf staring at her, chasing her through the woods, always stopping just short of making contact with her. He seemed to be laughing at her, toying with her just to see her terrified reaction. Needless to say, she had woken up tired and aggravated that morning. After breakfast, she covertly told her grandfather, who was still sitting at the dining room table with a cup of tea and his newspaper, that she would be heading out to take some photos. Making an innocent face at his knowing look he gave her, she escaped through the front door and down the steps before either one of her parents could saddle her with the responsibility of watching her brother Kamal. Taking the road from her house down to the main road, she waved at the passing car filled with friendly smiles before quickly crossing the road to the other side. Continuing down the road until it ended at a sandy dead end, she slowly picked her way down the tall dune down to the beach. Tarki's coast was nothing like the ideal coastline one imagined when thinking of a beachside town. Nearly a half a mile wide, the deep stretch of barren sand was dotted with tenacious vines and driftwood and bordered by huge sand dunes. Turning her face to the ocean breeze, Sana closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Salt water stung her nose, gloriously reminding her why she loved coming to the beach. Feeling her mood lift even higher, she walked with excited purpose towards a small cluster of abandoned rowboats piled up near a cluster of protruding rocks near the shore, with deep rotted holes and their wood beaten and splintered over time from the harsh sea winds. The boats were a perfect subject. Finding a tangled knot of fishing line and thick blue fishing rope, half buried in the sand, Sana drug it over and laid it on the bottom of the boat before cradling her camera to her eye and readjusting her camera's focus on the new target. Checking the LCD screen, she turned away from the sun to get a better view when she glimpsed the figure standing at the top of the hill. Instantly, Sana knew without the need to shield her eyes from the sun's glare exactly who the tall, lean body belonged to. Earlier that week she had helped out and attended the annual summer festival, an event she eagerly looked forward to every year, stacking a few chairs and running a few errands for people across town as they set up was worth it for the magical experience of the festival. Fireworks, food vendors, handmade goods, and above all else an outdoor area of old movies projected on a large white screen. The festival was pure summer magic. But this year was different. As she helped out, she had an unmistakable feeling of her every move being watched. Looking up a handful of times, Sana couldn't pinpoint anyone staring at her, deciding to try her best to ignore the odd hair-raising sensation she had grabbed for another stack of folding chairs. That was when she saw him standing on the other side of the long dolly that held the neatly stacked folding chairs. The boy stood there staring directly at her. His eyes, she nearly gasped, they weren't normal. It felt as if she was staring across the savanna grasslands to some unknown predator. Gold with flecks of bronze circling large piercing pupils, his eyes pinned her down to where she stood. Fear and awareness swirled together inside of her, changing the rhythm of her heart and the pace of each breath. He had frightened her. That day she had run away, not bothering with finishing the task she was given, and quickly found herself a new one on the other side of the festival grounds, hoping to put much distance between herself and that predatory boy. But he was here now, and she didn't have anywhere to run to. Turning her back to the hill, she prayed he would go away. Maybe she would just walk along the beach in the other direction, she considered. If he saw that she was not so subtly leaving, maybe he would get the hint and leave her alone. Since that day at the festival, she had heard a couple of the girls working at the hardware store's checkout counter whispering about him. It wasn't hard at all to discern they were speaking about the same guy. They kept mentioning his sexy golden eyes. Apparently, he was the type of guy every girl wanted and every father hated. Well, none of that mattered to her. Sana wanted nothing to do with him. Going past the decrepit boat, Sana walked over the black rocky terrain that jutted from the rising cliffs and into the crashing waters. She just needed to get over the rocky part and up the steep slope of grass she spotted on the other side. Hidden from the road's view by the cliffs, Sana cautiously began to make her way across the slippery rocks. "You'll get your shoes wet." The taunting warning rang out loudly, cutting easily through the sound of the loud ocean waves. Stiffening, Sana resisted the urge to allow her shoulders to sag in obvious disappointment at her failed attempt to flee. Taking a deep breath, she turned around to see the boy standing just on the other side of the dilapidated boat, smiling at her. Sana's breath caught itself somewhere between her chest and throat just as her stomach tightened at the sight of him. His canine teeth were sharp, too sharp to be normal. Everything about him seemed dangerous and wrong. Wearing a pair of worn jeans that she assumed at one time were black now just looked faded and gray. The chalky blue shirt he wore was an unnerving contradiction to her senses. Loose-fitting and wrinkled, the shirt somehow still outlined his lean, muscular frame. Sana could see from the powerful rounds of his shoulders and the corded muscles in his taut forearms that there was a deep current of power that ran through his lazy casual stance. Dark, naturally tanned skin and shoulder-length hair that was so black it seemed to absorb the light around him. This boy had all the ingredients for the phrase, devastatingly handsome. His narrowed eyes and defined face gave him a strong stoic profile that exuded the feeling of a calm strength, making it even more out of place on a teenager. Seeing that she wasn't going to say anything, he nodded his head with a smirk, as if confirming some inner hunch. Looking at his shoes, he lifted one toe of his sneakers to crunch a broken shell further into the sand. "Let me guess," he began, taking a moment before sliding his gaze up to hers. "You're one of those shy, quiet types of girl that keeps her head down when she walks and always says yes to favors asked because you can't stand the thought of people not liking you." With each word, his golden gaze grew sharper and his smile crueler. "Am I right?" Sana frowned at the too accurate assessment of her flaws. Subtly she tried to glance around, assessing her current predicament. The cliffs to her right blocked both of them from view from the road or anyone walking by. With a steep hill to her back and the ocean to her left, she was cornered by this strange boy. Looking beyond his shoulder, Sana ignored his knowing expression as she mentally imagined herself running past him. Sensing her thoughts, he stepped to his right, directly in her field of vision. "I am going to take that as a yes," he laughed. Tired of him and this entire situation, she gave him a level look. "Is this some sort of game? Do you want me to try and guess your personality or something from your obvious bad boy rebel look you have going on?" She waved a hand up and down at him. Slowly, dangerously slow, his bright eyes slitted with unidentifiable anger that came across the short distance, separating them like a tidal wave. Taking a fearful step back, Sana immediately regretted her words. His voice was quiet and intense when he spoke. "You could never even begin to know about me, beautiful." She heard the veiled warning in his tone. "You're right," she conceded with a soft nod. Turning her face to the ocean, she used the incoming breeze to help push back some of her hair that had been mussed by the wind. With what she hoped was a cool, indifferent look, she looked at him. "Nor do I want to. Goodbye." Gathering her courage, she walked quickly past him towards the hill that led to the road. Sana didn't miss the momentary look of surprise that passed over his handsome face before settling back to that wicked sharp smile. "What if I show you something really worth taking pictures of?" he called out from behind her. Sana didn't dare stop walking, clutching her camera that swung around her hip. With each step, she trudged forward up the hill. No, thank you. Are you sure? His voice was closer now, so much closer it sounded as if he was right over her shoulder. Something crunched behind her. Turning her head slightly, her stomach jumped at the sight of him walking just behind her. He continued his appeal. An abandoned circus sure sounds like an interesting subject to shoot to me, don't you agree? She stopped, turning around. She couldn't hide the curiosity evident on her face. Seeing that he had her attention, he looked at the ground as he took a couple of steps towards her with both hands stuffed in his pockets before slowly tilting his face back to hers. The wind blew some of his silky black hair over to one side of his head. He looked like every cologne model there ever was, trying to imbue the bad boy image, but his was real. It still has the colorful tents, bits of supplies, and even a couple of ancient rusted-up cages. Where is it exactly? She said, folding her arms over her chest, partly out of nervousness and partly in skepticism. Sanaa didn't bother hiding her suspicion. His grin widened as he looked beyond her, as if trying to phrase his next words carefully. I can show you. Where? She repeated firmly. About a half-hour hike into the forest, he admitted, devious laughter glittering in his gold eyes. Making a scoffing noise in her throat, she promptly turned on her heel and began trudging back up the thick sand. Okay, I know how that sounds, he laughed behind her. She could hear him coming closer until he finally caught up and jogged around her with loping ease through the sand. Blocking her path, he held out both hands. I promise. You're safe with me. My uncle would have me skinned and hung to dry if something were to happen to the precious Sanaa bought on my watch. She couldn't help but stiffen at the use of her name. How did he know her name? He made it seem as if her name was common knowledge in this town, which definitely wasn't. When she visited every summer, she mostly hung out in or around her grandparents' house. There were only a handful of girls her age she was acquainted with enough to call friends, and even that was a stretch. With each year, the girls in the town seemed to mature more and more, far faster than Sanaa. Their conversations were constantly about boys and sex, or mapping out their futures of marriage and children. Sex was not a topic Sanaa was equipped to discuss, and it showed. With pitted smiles and knowing glances at one another, the girls always politely changed to other topics for Sanaa's sake, but it only made Sanaa feel more like a pariah. Everyone knows who you are, Sanaa, he said, as if reading her thoughts. How could they not? The beautiful girl who volunteers her time around town with her wide innocent eyes and honest smile. His eyes traveled from her eyes and settled on her lips far too long for comfort before meeting her gaze again. From my understanding, you're like a town treasure, to be protected at all cost. I'm nothing like that, she argued, hating every word of the goody two-shoe assessment he was casting on her. Seeing that he hit a nerve, his smile deepened with an edge of cruelty. Of course you are. Why else would my normally friendly uncle, Adam Watiz, threaten me to stay away from you? Surprised, Sanaa momentarily forgot her outrage. You're Watiz? Blinking, his smile faltered a bit as shock colored his eyes. Lifting one black eyebrow in a sardonic arch, he gestured at his face and body. Isn't it obvious? I suppose so, she tried to recover. She felt silly for not guessing he was related to the Watiz family. I guess I wasn't thinking about that. Lord, you are precious, he laughed. The genuine amusement only made his handsome face even more beautiful. What do your parents do, keep you in a bubble all year? Hurt lanced through her at that, moving to sidestep him, since at some point or another he had moved to block her way yet again. She wasn't going to stand here and be berated any longer. But he quickly stepped in front of her, blocking her path again. Exasperated, she was about to shout at him when he spoke. My name is Zaccariah Watiz. You can call me Zac, he offered, his tone friendlier. And I promise you will be safe with me. There was truth in his words, but a lie shining in his eyes. Letting her gaze drift from his and pass over his body, Sanaa turned away as she thought about his offer. He was without a doubt on a whole other level than her. Sexual prowess exuded from him in waves. With one hand stuffed casually in his pocket, the sun gleamed off his naturally bronze skin and black hair. The definition of hours and hours of hard work had already made its path down his arms, outlining muscles from one another, pushing their hard shapes to the surface. With each movement of his arms, she could see the heavily corded muscles flex underneath his taut skin, reminding her of his strength. She wasn't just out of her league with this boy. She wasn't even playing the right game. I can't. The words were barely out of her mouth when he turned around and began walking up the hill. Same time tomorrow. I will meet you in the clearing behind the drugstore. He called over his shoulder. Wait. What? What just happened? Staring at him walk away, Sana could feel the uneasy sensation in her stomach transform into a foreign feeling of excitement and dread. There was no way she could see him tomorrow. Her parents would lose their minds at the very notion of her talking to a guy like Zaccariah, much less traipsing off in the forest alone with him. No, she definitely could not go with him. He was dangerous by all accounts. Looking at the deep footprints in the sand at the spot he just vacated, she recalled the feeling of heart-thrashing excitement. As she talked to him, it was a feeling she never felt with any other guy before. Catching her train of thoughts, she frowned. No, absolutely not. She would be a fool to go anywhere with a boy like that. But a fool she was. It bothered her to think how long she had spent in the mirror that next day, looking at her outfit. After multiple changes, Sana finally decided on a pair of olive khaki shorts and a peach-colored t-shirt. The entire way to the drugstore, she imagined a multitude of scenarios that all involved her being stood up and laughed at by Zaccariah. Maybe he was joking, or worse maybe this was all a prank he had concocted with his friends, who were all waiting nearby to laugh at her. She stopped walking a couple of times on her way there, eventually forcing herself to take another hesitant step forward. Sana told herself if he wasn't there when she got there, she would leave immediately. She would not for any reason stand around looking a fool for that boy with the odd golden gaze. Rounding the back corner of the drugstore, her stomach dropped at the sight of the empty clearing running up against the drugstore's brick wall. No one was there. Anger began to flood through her veins as she stepped back into the pair of strong hands. Sana nearly screamed. I didn't think you would show up. Zaccaria looked down at her from over her head, giving her a large upside-down smile. Stepping quickly out of his warm grip, she turned around to face him properly. I shouldn't have. You're probably right, he admitted deviously. Before she could argue at that response, he grabbed her hand and began to lead her into the forest. Now, let's go see that Carney graveyard, shall we? He announced happily. For a moment there, Sana feared he was going to try and hold her hand hostage and his the whole way. Thankfully he let go, choosing to walk alongside her instead of leading her the whole way as she feared. The forest was peaceful and cool, keeping the summer sun constantly interrupted by the soft canopy of leaves above. Both her and Zaccariah's mood seemed to shift accordingly to their serene surroundings, him losing the taunting edge to his tone as he asked her about Seattle, and her losing some of her suspicions of him as she slowly responded, although he seemingly couldn't help himself from a few snide comments when she mentioned the private school she attended. Let me guess, it's an all-girls school, isn't it? So sure of himself about her answer, he gave her a waiting evil look, ready to laugh at her expected response. Not deigning to look at him, she tilted her chin higher and stared determinedly at the path ahead. It's a co-ed school for your information, she said haughtily. I'm not that sheltered. Do you have a boyfriend? No. She was so shocked at the sudden personal question the answer just tumbled from her lips. Have you ever had one? The smirk on his lips made her want to slap him. What is the need of asking me all of these personal questions? I thought you were just going to show me this supposed Carney site. It's nothing to worry about. I just like to know who I'm going to be up against, he said with a grin that showed off his sharp white teeth. Stopping, Sana stood stiff and straight, giving him her best commanding look. Look, I don't know what you think. No stopping, he reprimanded. Reaching back, he grabbed her hand, forcefully resuming her walking. I want to get you back before dinner, so that means no breaks until we get there. After walking through various trails, some being human-made and some animal-made, they finally came to a point in the forest where the tall pine trees thinned out just enough to allow both of their gazes to pan over the remnants of the past. The sight of the abandoned Carney equipment filled her with giddy excitement. Faded reds, yellows, and blues stuck out from the wild ferns and brush littering the forest floor. Heavily folded canvases of ancient circus Tents lay rotting, piled heavily on top of one another near dilapidated wooden wagons and rusty cages. Farther back were 2 rusted carnival rides that Sanaa could swear had to be dated from the 1920s. They were odd and cumbersome in their design and looked as if they would be positively lethal, even in their prime. With their wood eaten away by time and covered in badly chipping paint, the rides looked more like death machines rather than a source of thrilling entertainment. Zaccaria said nothing as she skittered from one object to another with visible excitement. She could feel his heavy, watchful gaze on her back as she focused her lens. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end at his silent observance, causing her finger to shake as she pressed in on the shutter. Release. Not looking at her as he walked around to an old wooden sign, he stopped to examine the faded antique. So, how do you like it? It's wonderful, she answered with a breathless smile. This truly was magnificent. Thank you for her words of thanks caught in her throat as she turned to see him standing directly in front of her. Zaccaria, she hated the stutter of fear in her voice, but his sudden presence was truly alarming. One moment he was across the small clearing and the next he was here in front of her with his long black hair gleaming in the dappled sunlight and his sharp smile wide. Her heart felt heavy as if it were beating slower and stronger before reacting to his presence. Her hands were suddenly clammy, and her feet felt like lead as she tried to turn away from his predatory golden eyes. She may have never had a boyfriend, but every feminine cell in her body knew how to label this sudden feeling between them. I don't think this is good, she began weakly. Probably not, his voice becoming softer as he stepped closer. She could see his gaze hop from hers and to her lips before meeting hers again. But I can't seem to stop this pull between us. Was that what this was? This indescribable feeling of magnetism that was drawing her in at every glance of those glowing golden eyes? Was that why she foolishly followed this boy with the sharp smile into the forest alone? I. Her words never came out. Sanaa's heart seized in a momentary panic as she felt him push her back against a tree. The panic was quickly replaced by something she could have never prepared for. He gave her no time to formulate her thoughts, no time to steel herself before. He was leaning over her and dipping his head to hers. The pressure of his lips against hers was like being pulled in by a riptide. There was nothing she could do but hang on and experience the tumult of sensations, from the unexpected softness to his lips to the warmth of his hard chest pressing slightly into hers. Each sensation was new and terrifying all at once. Pulling away from her, he gave her a slight frown, gently taking her chin between his forefinger and thumb. She felt him pull her lips apart slightly. Heat of embarrassment flooded her face as she realized what he wanted and what she did wrong. With a soft, almost understanding smile that nearly undid her. Then and there, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against her parted ones, and whispered, again. This time his warm lips found hers with an exploratory hunger she did not expect. Slanting over her lips with his, he let his tongue drift against the inside edge of her lips before slipping deeper. Sanaa jumped against him, but his arm, which she realized was wrapped around her back, only pulled her tighter against him, pressing her into the hard warmth of his chest. He smelled like the forest and soap, the scent melding into her senses as he taught her without words to move her tongue against his. It was the light feminine moan she made in the back of her throat that changed the soft teaching kiss into something that would forever haunt her dreams. Using his other arm that he had braced against the tree above her head, Zaccaria wrapped it around her along with his other, crushing her fully against him. Zaccaria, she began to protest. She could feel every inch of him pressed against her, the solid muscles in his chest pressing her breasts flat against him while the hard ridge in his pants grazed against the apex of her thighs. With head-spinning heat. God, you make my full name sound so damn good. He groaned so deep it sounded almost inhuman. Burying his hand in her hair, Sanaa gasped at the feeling of her head being tilted back further. Kissing her again with renewed force, she could feel the graze of his sharp canines against her lips as his tongue danced slowly and deliberately with hers, drawing out more of her moans. A sudden growl ripped through his throat, and he grabbed at her leg, hooking it over his waist. In this new position, she could feel the hard press of his groin grind against her center, sending sparks of forbidden heat rushing through her. She had to stop this. It was going too far too fast. Pushing at his chest, she was only able to gain a few inches between them. "Zaccaria, please," she breathed just before his mouth found hers again. Glimpses of his golden eyes made her breath catch. His eyes, they were glowing. They were somehow glowing in broad daylight. "I want to stop," she tried again, shoving harder this time. His body stilled. Pulling his head back, he gave her a hard, silent look. Fear and shame coalesced inside of her at his silent anger. She had no idea what to say. He was disappointed in her, she knew that. She always knew this would happen. She just knew she would end up angering or disappointing any guy she ever got with. Sana wasn't skilled like some of the girls in her school. She never knew what to say around guys and even less about what to do. She wanted to know, but it just felt like this was moving so fast, far beyond her realm of control, and it frightened her. "I'm sorry." She looked down at the ground as he let go of her and backed away. Running a smoothing hand down her shirt and shorts, she focused on the clump of leaves between their feet. "I don't really know what to do in these types of." "Don't apologize." Zach's hand came up between them and lifted her chin. His eyes weren't as bright as before, and Sana couldn't help but wonder if she had imagined their golden glow in the heat of the moment. Tilting his head with a smirk, he leaned one hand on the tree next to her head. "I told you that you would be safe with me, and I meant it." Nodding, she tried to stamp down the urge to cry that stung at her eyes. She felt so childish and relieved all at once. "Come on." Backing away from the tree, Zaccaria caught her hand. "Let me take you back home." The walk back home was silent, although not at all awkward. He led her through the forest, zigzagging here and there through trails she would have never discovered on her own. Although there were no words shared between them, the silent language between them was overwhelming and compelling. With each gentle touch as he guided her along the shadowy forest filled her with breathless excitement she hated herself for. His fingers purposely sought for her bare skin as he grabbed her waist, lifting her up and over fallen trees. They tightened warmly around her hand as he tugged her closer through tight spots. He still wanted her despite her fear. He was making that plain to see. Stopping just beyond the tree line, they could see her grandparents' house sitting in the clearing. From the looks of it, her parents were home as well. Turning to her, Zaccaria gave her a mischievous smirk. "Go now before I kiss you again." Sensing that he was very serious, Sana rushed past him, breaking through the tree line into the bright sun. She didn't need to look over her shoulder to know he was still